actually a slightly incorrect word. I used to study the teaching of evolution and creationism in the Middle East. I'm now studying genetics and racial science in the Middle East, but same basic idea. So now I'm going to introduce the keynote speaker and panelists, and we'll get everything started. So our keynote speaker is Dr. Salman Hamid, who is an associate professor of integrated science and humanities at Hampshire College. He's also the director of the Center for the Study of Science and Muslim Societies, and the editor of Irtiqa, or Evolution, a science and religion blog. And his work has focused largely on perceptions of evolutionary theory and creationism within religious communities, both in the Muslim world and among Christians in the United States. Our next panelist will be Dr. Ihab Abu Hayf, a principal investigator of the Abu Hayf Lab and Canada Research Chair in Evolutionary Developmental Biology at McGill University in Canada. Dr. Abu Hayf's lab integrates the fields of ecology and molecular, developmental, and evolutionary biology in order to understand how genes and environments interact in order to generate genetic diversity and adaptation. Our third panelist will be Dr. Omar Sultan Haq, an instructor and postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychology at Harvard. He also works at the program in psychiatry and the law at Harvard Medical School and is the co-director of the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics for the American unit. He has published on numerous branches of the humanities and sciences, including psychology of religion, Islamic studies, moral psychology, religious ethics, forensic psychiatry, and bioethics. And lastly, we'll have Dr. Rana Dajani, the assistant professor of molecular biology at Hashima University in Jordan. She's currently serving as a Fulbright Fellow at Yale University, and is also the founder of We Love Reading, a community-based literacy initiative which has opened about 130 libraries in Jordan. So without further ado, we'll get started with keynote speech by Dr. Hamid.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the American Islamic Congress and Project Nur for organizing this and for bringing all the fantastic panelists here. Because I think that itself is a pleasure to be with all the people here. So let me start. So I think I have half an hour. That's where I'm going to go. So give me a 5-minute warning here, just in case I forget. Okay, so. Of course, today's title is there a clash between, my title is there a clash between the theory of evolution and Islam? But theory of evolution in general is, as you know, the controversial topic. We hear about it usually in newspapers. So here is Time magazine cover, which is Evolution Wars. Now, this is not about the Islamic world. This is not about the Muslims. This is what's going on in the US. So over the period of time, especially in the last couple of decades, creationism, the idea that most of the life forms have been created as is, has been actually spreading around the world. And those kind of debates are taking place, but a lot of those particular ideas are coming out of the context of the US. In particular debates that took place, actually started in the early 1920s, with the evangelical movement, and so within the U.S. context, when people talk about evolution wars, usually it is about young Earth creationism. And that particular idea is that the world was created 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. And within that context, the time frame is also short, and all of the species were created as is within those 6,000 to 10,000 years. Evolution gets roped in there, but I think that particular problem is often a problem of geology. Because from geology, we know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and there's plenty of evidence for that. Okay, so within the US context, that creationism, when people talk about, it's called evolution wars, but often it is actually about young Earth creation, about the idea where the Earth is young. Along with that, evolution goes. Now, in the Muslim world, these kind of debates are also coming in, and I will start with Pokemon, because why not, right? And so, well, Pokemon, cartoon, exciting, entertaining, but in Saudi Arabia, it was banned in 2002. And one of the reasons, there were multiple reasons why it was banned, but one of the reasons why it was given why it was banned was that the characters of Pokemon were based on the theory of evolution. And so, poor Pokemon, they got banned because of evolution. Now that made news. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of media in all of these debates towards the end of the talk, but I should mention that that made news, okay? The following year, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who was at that time, he was the Egyptian cleric, and at that time he was in exile actually, and he was asked this question about Pokemon, and he was asked, well, Pokemon was banned because of the theory of evolution. What is your stance on that? And he said, well, I don't know much about the theory of evolution, but if Pokemon was banned based upon the theory of evolution, then I think the ban is right. So, actually, Yusuf al-Qaradawi's position now is cited actually on some of the websites as a position of Islam against evolution. Now, if we're staying with the news item, this is an imam in central London, in a mosque in London, Osama Hassan, and last year there was a lot of controversy around that because he actually gave a talk at his mosque. He gave a lecture at his mosque on evolution, and he said, well, evolution is fine with Islam. And there was a lot of reaction to his talk, including one person recording a YouTube video. And YouTube videos, you should always be skeptical about it. But anyway, he used a YouTube video to give veiled threats to him. And again, that was a huge news. And then later on, Osama Hassan backed away from some of his positions, not all. But this is just a setting up a little bit of the difference also between when we talk about creationism, what is in the US, and also setting up a stage, well, that the reason why we are having this conversation with this title here is not about, say, for example, I don't know, thermodynamics or sort of like, how do chemical bonds form or something like that. We are talking about evolution because that is a particular area where people feel uncomfortable about. Some people feel uncomfortable about, and that is an area of tension, and these are some places where those tensions have been. So what I'm going to do is, for the first 10 minutes, I'm going to take a philosophical approach, that there are some challenges that theory of evolution raises. And I think those challenges are, some of it are for Islam, but I think in general for religion, I mean, there are particular challenges that we have to understand if we believe that theory of evolution is the way species have evolved here on Earth, have developed here on Earth. So that raises certain kind of questions. But I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I'm going to spend just the first 10 minutes or so, and I'm sure there are actual biologists here, so I'm not going to spend time sort of like, explaining biology because they can do a much better job than me. But then what I'm going to spend most of my time is actually taking, instead of Islam and evolution, the issue of Muslims and evolution. And that's a more sociological aspect that, well, yes, philosophically the question is, well, what is the relationship between Islam and evolution? Sure. But I think another question is, but how do Muslims in general think about that position? So, and I'm going to spend time on that. Okay, so let's get down to the philosophical approach. So the question is there a clash between Islam and evolution? Well, the first, and actually, I'm asked this question quite a bit, and my answer is, well, it depends, right? I mean, it depends upon what your definition of Islam and of evolution is. So is there a clash with the theory of evolution? Well, there are a couple of ideas, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them in a second. But one of the key ideas is that, well, a common descent, that is that species are connected, that there's a common ancestor, or ancestors, but way back. And all life here on Earth is interconnected, and it has developed via the process of evolution over this long period of time. If the idea of some person's understanding of Islam is that this is incorrect, then yes, there is a clash between Islam and evolution. Not a typology, but I mean, that's what it comes out to, that there would be a clash in there. Okay, but oftentimes, of course, we don't care generally about other insect animals and birds and trees and stuff like that. We are usually concerned about us because we are human-centric people. So we are humans, so we kind of favor us. And so the big question that comes in is like, about humans, and that's usually where the conflict arises. And so within this aspect, is there a clash between Islam and evolution?
this is the place where usually people raise objection, and that is about the origins of humans. And the question comes in whether humans have been specially created, or are they the process of evolution here on Earth. So if Islam, the interpretation of Islam one has, goes with that, then there is a clash. Is it? And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit through it. And again, as I mentioned, there are professional biologists here, so I'll let them focus on the details. But let's talk about philosophically where are some tensions that come in if one accepts the theory of evolution. And again, I should mention that almost all biologists accept the theory of evolution. It's an established idea of science. Now, what kind of challenges it raises? And I should mention that this theory is important because design, especially for biology, it was considered as something special. The intricacy of life, the intricacy of biology was considered that you cannot explain purely by natural processes. So one of the really profound changes that the theory of evolution does is that it can explain the complicated machinery. And I'm using this word loosely because machinery, you can think about engineering. But no, the complicated machinery, this metaphorical words, well, that can be explained purely via natural processes. Right? And that is a challenge that comes out of evolution. I think it's hard to deny that challenge. Okay? Specifically, common descent. Okay? Common descent that, yes, if you accept the natural explanation of evolution, then we go, well, there were early species, and over the long period of time, they have become complicated, complex, and some have not changed that much. Some species have changed, some have died. In fact, most species are extinct today. And humans who've been here on this earth for a very short period of time compared to the 4.5 billion years. So it raises this question, well, okay, you have a common descent. How does it feature into religion? And the specific reason for this tension is because of the mechanism. So people actually use the word Darwin with evolution. Well, the idea of evolution actually was around before Darwin. But what Darwin did in particular, and Darwin was not alone, people always focus on his personality, but Alfred Russel Wallace, for example, was a co-discoverer. He was writing stuff at the same time. Is the mechanism. And the details of mechanisms are still in debate, but the mechanism of change is like there are mutations which are random. And then there is selection, and if those mutations are helpful, then those mutations are selected. And the other mutations, which most of them are actually not useful, they are thrown away. Now, this is a very simplistic picture, but this is the overall picture regarding evolution, and it leads to certain kind of implications. So oftentimes, the general perception comes in that evolution, does that mean atheism? And this is physicist Steven Weinberg, Nobel laureate, and he actually explicitly said, I actually really like the way he phrases it, and he says that evolution does not necessarily imply atheism, or doesn't actually, he says evolution doesn't make belief in God impossible. It makes not believing in God possible. Meaning to say that, well, here is a process where things can be explained naturally. So it doesn't mean, just because you accept evolution, doesn't mean that you have to give up the belief in God, but rather that if you don't believe in God, now you have an explanation of how the biology, the complex biology has taken place. Okay, so this is Steven Weinberg. The other place where this comes in, Stephen Jay Gould, Harvard biologist who died a few years ago. His idea was that, well, partly because of the random nature, and partly because there are so many things that go into 4.5 billion years of evolution, what he famously said was that if you were to run the tape again, by the way, so he was writing at the time when there were tapes. So for people who don't know, these are times. Okay, so he said, well, if you run the tape again, okay, the likelihood that you are going to come up again with humans is negligible. So this is, again, this raises a question. This is, I think, this is the issue of where the tension comes in. So here is an idea, well, okay, accept evolution, but okay, well, but the contingency that humans would appear is like, is really random in that perspective. But there are others who take the same idea. So this is Simon Conway Morris, who argues that, well, there is sort of convergence, and so there are some traits, including perhaps intelligence, like, that those can be convergent, meaning to say that if you run the tape again, there are some traits, some characteristics that will still come up because they are particularly useful. Okay, eyes is an example, for example, one of them. That one eyes have the PhD appeared multiple times, independent origins of that. And I'm going to throw in John Paul II also. Why not? Like, when we're talking about these tensions, well, for him, actually, he said in the mid-90s that, well, that evolution is an idea that is correct. But he argued for a God-guided process. So he argued that, well, yes, there are these things happening, but the overall, the direction of change is being guided by God. That's another way of doing that. So I just wanted to put those multiple viewpoints in front, because these are some of the implications and how people have tried to deal with them. Okay. But what I want to argue is to step back a little. And I think what we are talking about here is a broader challenge of naturalism. This particular problem that we are dealing with biology here, well, this is, for the last 150 years, this was about the intricacies of biology, but people have ascribed these type of things to physics also, astronomy also. And so, the formation of the Earth, for example, in the 18th century, was considered a topic that cannot be touched by science. It's a topic that is beyond the realm of science, beyond the scientific methodology. Well, today, when we look at the textbooks, and we look at that, well, there's a formation of the solar system. We actually know very well how the solar system was formed. People don't bring in, for example, within that, God-guided gravity. Right? And we could say, well, how did this form? And we could say, well, it was gravity. They did that, right? And there was a cloud, and the collapse of gas cloud that formed the solar system. There were planets and how they formed. And there are very detailed mechanisms of how these things were formed. But on the other hand, and by the way, same thing is with the weather also, right? I mean, for a while, weather people say, like, if you pray, like, it would rain, actually, people still do that. But on the other hand, people have very good ideas of how weather patterns change. I mean, the forecasts actually have been getting much better, right? And so you look at the weather, like, okay, there is a hurricane coming, okay, and Hurricane Irene from last year in this area, and you try to prepare for that, okay? It's beautiful, calm, and quiet. You don't go like, oh, I don't know what's going on. No, you look at the weather map and you go with that aspect, right? So those are natural explanations that have removed some aspects of the role of God. Doesn't mean that from all places it's gone, but certainly. So for example, if you were to talk about how was the earth formed, well, now we don't talk about that the earth was formed as is. We talk about the process it was formed, and that process is a natural process governed by gravity. Okay. So what I want to say is, like, so there is, in some sense, there is a challenge of providential nature of religion that these kinds of things challenge us. Okay. And but that doesn't mean that it rules out God. All it means, because you can always ask this question, which actually Newton struggled with this question about gravity, and he wanted to add God in. And then towards the end he said, well, that doesn't work. And he said, but you still have this room of why gravity? So he said, well, God used this mechanism to form the earth using gravity. But in some sense, you have the same question, why natural selection? Well, it could have been anything, right? Well, why natural selection? So you can argue, well, the fact that kind of a law exists, that is because of God. So in some sense, here is my last editorial comment associated with this particular type of thing. Well, this is what gravity can do in 13.5 billion years. You start with, this is the map of the universe. So if you want to impress somebody, you say, hey, here's the whole universe. But this is sort of like the variations in the background, sort of like temperature you can think about the universe. And that actually, that's looking at how the universe was a few 100,000 years after the Big Bang. over the period of time, galaxies formed. And that's an image from the Hubble Space Telescope. One of the deepest images that we've taken. This is sort of like every dot is a galaxy. And it's amazing. People are like, wow. And of course, towards the end, you have the Earth. And you go like, wow, 13.5 million years now, we are talking about sitting in this room. And look where we started and where we come in. And it's a spectacular. So this is sort of like what gravity, you have the process of gravity, what can do in 13.5 billion years. So perhaps you can draw a parallel and say, well, you have the process of natural selection, and what it can do in 4.5 billion years when you start with sort of like these small algae, bacteria, whatever, like, unicellular organisms, and you let them run this process, and 4.5 billion years later you end up with people. Okay, and those particular people, I'm originally from Pakistan, so I thought I'd put a picture of Pakistan from there. Okay, so people are everywhere. So it's not just that it's only Pakistanis evolved, not everybody. Okay, so and let me put a quote from this bearded guy who actually said this on his it is about religion. So probably all organic beings which have ever lived in this earth have descended from one primordial form into which life was first breathed. There is grandeur in this view of life that whilst this planet has gone cycling according to fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless, forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. In fact, Darwin actually made the same connection between the law of gravity in some sense and the way things have evolved. Okay. But that's a challenge, that's a tension, that's where it goes in. And again, I want to make sure that, I want to say, that doesn't mean leave God out, but it certainly produces some sorts of challenges. But are these the challenges that people are talking about when people say those tensions come in with Osama Hassan, Pokemon, evolution wars? Are those the kind of questions that are being addressed? So let me spend the last 15 minutes on this topic. So first of all, well, when we say Islam or Muslims and evolution, or we say Islam and evolution, well, we have to ask about which Islam, which Muslim, and where they are living, and so on and so forth. Well, here is a sort of like a rough map of where Muslims are in majority Muslim populations, and it goes all the way from West Africa to the Middle East, of course, and then former Soviet republics, and then you have Southeast Asia, in fact, the largest Muslim country. I was there just last week. Indonesia is way out there, and then you also have pockets in Europe. And so it's really, it would be incredible to assume that all Muslims think alike. And so this is the kind of a question that we have to ask, that when we are asking if there is a clash between Islam and the theory of evolution, or how do Muslims think, well, what impact do these cultural variations bring in? Is it the same in Islam? Or because in some sense, oftentimes when people ask me this question, what do you think about Islam and evolution? They talk about something normative, something that's hanging out over there. But in reality, there is a whole variations, and I haven't even mentioned the dark green areas, for example. Those are where the Shias are in majority, and the other places are Sunnis, and of course there are other variations within it. So just please keep this in mind, because this is an important point, that whatever we are talking about, we should do that. Okay. So let's look at, just take an example of the variations within it, and one way to take that is looking at the textbooks of how evolution is included in textbooks. And so, for example, in Saudi Arabia, that is one example where there is explicit, not only explicit creationism, but anti-evolution is there. And the author of that paper, Burton, and she's our moderator. So if you have more questions, you can ask her. And if I'm saying something wrong, you can blame me for that. Okay, so Saudi Arabia, this is one country where I recognize that, yeah, there is anti-evolution. Turkey, well, this overall creationism is very little, but overall evolution is taught actually in Turkey. But it is a battle. It's a source of tension over there. But if we go to Iran, Malaysia, Egypt, Syria, well, it's actually straightforward evolution in there. Okay. Now, Alisa, I'm going to ask you this question right on spot. In Iran, human evolution is also included, or just evolution?
They're silent on the.
They're silent. Okay, so that is actually consistent with all the countries where evolution is taught. But oftentimes, human evolution, it's not they go and say, oh, human evolution is wrong. No, just not mentioned. And so for example, I'm going to show you in 1 second. So for example, in Pakistan, the textbooks actually have, in fact, religious influence. So just think about it. There are debates within the US about the textbooks, especially Texas School Board and other places, okay? There are candidates, and I'm not mentioning which party, but there are candidates that come in, they actually say, like, that no, evolution should not be included in textbooks and so on and so forth, okay? Elections are 2 weeks away, so which party you are going to vote for. Okay, right? Now, evolution is taught as a fact of science in these things. And again, partly it might be because there is no problem with an old Earth. Again, within the US, there is a separate belt associated with that. Right? But separation of church and state, some of the arguments within the US context lie on, in fact, people who are the proponents of the teaching of evolution also make an argument regarding separation of church and state. Right? But it's not clear whether that is the only way to go around it. And Pakistan provides the example. As Pakistan and US are right now on opposite ends of political spectrum, they are also opposite ends on textbook spectrum. Okay, so why? Okay, here's an example. This is the front page of a 12th grade biology textbook. Okay, and here is evolution, but on top of it, actually, there's a Quranic verse. It doesn't explicitly sort of say something more specifically about evolution. It's about sort of there are species that change, and it takes it out from the Quran. In fact, there are other Quranic verses at the beginning of the textbook, but in most chapters there are none, except chapter on evolution and chapter on embryology. Those are the only 2 places there are the Quranic verses. Now, after that, there is no mention of religion. The chapter goes on to say evolution is a fact of science, and it talks about natural selection, and it talks about history, it talks about Lamarck, it talks about Darwin, so on and so forth. The chapter after that, you would expect about human evolution. No, actually, it goes into biotechnology or ecology or something like that. It doesn't say evolution is wrong. Okay? But let me say one more thing. The science foundations of 14 Muslim countries, including Iran, Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia, they signed actually an inter-academy panel, an IAP statement, which is an inter-academy panel on international issues, a statement in support of evolution. Not just evolution, in fact, right at the bottom you would say that they actually signed a statement in which they talked about commonalities in the structure of the genetic code of all organisms living today, including humans, clearly indicate their common primordial origin, including humans. Okay? So these are science foundations of 14 countries that have signed. So already, if you came here in this talk thinking that, well, there is a position of Islam and evolution, I should mention actually there is no single position, and this just gives you a variety purely from that perspective. But I should mention that I've become, over the past few years, a fan of oral interviews. And my original training, by the way, a long time ago, was in astronomy, and I worked on how stars form in galaxies. And one thing that was there was that you look at the galaxies, and galaxies are over there, and you study them on a clear night. It's beautiful. And galaxies don't talk back. And that was fine. Okay, so the last few years, actually, I've been talking to individuals and so say human research, and what I find is very challenging, but it's also very rewarding because I find like you're interviewing and and it goes like, oh, okay, all right. So anyway, but I have become a fan of it because people are far more complicated. Perhaps that's the difference between physics and biology. I also find people are inconsistent also, and that's where some of the fascinating stuff happens. Okay? It is the inconsistencies that I love. Okay? I hope you don't find inconsistencies in that talk. I'm assuming I try to be consistent on it. But anyway, so so here we've been interviewing Muslim medical doctors and medical students in about 7 countries. Some of them are Muslim majority countries, but we are also looking at Muslims in Europe and in the US. And so this is a sample. This is just a simple question. So these are oral interviews that go for about 15 minutes or so. And this is just a snippet that I'm going to show today, because there's a lot more information that people say. But this is just, in the middle of the interview, we ask people this question: do you personally accept or reject the theory of evolution? Okay, so this is from Pakistani doctors here in the US, or Muslim doctors in the US, and these are about like 24 doctors or so. And most of them actually gave us the answer, yeah, they accept evolution. Very few actually rejected it, and then there are others, and others is where actually they don't give a straight answer, and they sort of and that's very important. People don't give straight answers. If you give them a written form, that would be different. And that's why I think the real information lies in oral interviews, because that's a lot of things happen. But just to contrast, again, going to the cultural aspects, this is Malaysia, and we asked them the same question. The interviews are identical, actually. This is with Malaysian doctors and students, and there are close to about 30 or so. We asked them the same question, and only 3 of those 30 actually said yes, they accepted it. Okay? A lot of them rejected it, but a lot of them were others also. So just to put it, so you have acceptance, of course, but there is also acceptance of human evolution, and we will come back to that point in a second. There is also rejection. But what we find is that most people have never really thought about it. Actually, when we ask them this question, they go like, oh, yeah, I don't know. Or some people have thought about it, but just at the base level of one answer, and then if you ask them further questions, people have not thought about it. And but that has been our majority of our experience. But let me go further. This question, because that often comes up in these different surveys, Gallup poll, how many people accept evolution? Well, there's more to it, and that's some of the things that I want to show you. We asked them, okay, do you think microbial evolution is possible? Yeah, so that's still using the principle of natural selection. Is microbial evolution possible? Well, the numbers go way up. So this is the Pakistani physicians in the US, and we found that only 1 person said no. But note that even people who said they didn't accept evolution, that's in the red, they also said, oh yeah, microbial evolution is possible. And actually the same was kind of true in Malaysian sample. Okay? So again, blue is the ones that said yes, they accept evolution. Red is the one they said no, they don't accept evolution, and rest of them were others. And we find that actually a bunch of people who said no, they don't accept evolution, when asked the question, do you think microbial evolution is possible, they said yes. Okay? Now these are medical doctors and medical students. Perhaps there is an element of practical things, seeing things. Antibiotics. I actually asked questions about that too. What about human evolution? Because ultimately, again, that was one of the sources of tension, and that does come up. Well, this is this question that are humans a product of evolution from prior animals? Okay. And by the way, oral interviews, we also discovered if you just ask this question, is human evolution, do humans evolve, or is human evolution possible? We get the answers, well, yes, people are taller or shorter or whatever, so there is, people think about human evolution in different ways in different cultures, so that's another source of confusion. So we actually try to pin it down very specifically. Are humans a product of evolution from prior animals? And actually most of the Pakistani physicians in the US said yes. These are Muslim doctors, this is some Muslims, right, saying yes. But everybody who actually said no to the evolution question also said no to human evolution. But look at Malaysia. Only 1 person actually who was a doctor who said yes to human evolution, and almost everybody said no. They are not even in neither category. They just said no. So this already tells you, okay, there's something else. So actually most of my work is understanding what kind of factors shape these responses. So let me, in the last few minutes, let me give you a little bit of the reasons why people say they reject evolution. And that's not necessarily human evolution. This is the question when we ask them oftentimes, can you tell me a little bit about, that's how we start the interviews, can you tell me a little bit about what you know about, have you heard of theory of evolution, and can you tell me a little bit about what you know about it? Some of the answers actually, where people who end up with, this is the answer we oftentimes get. Evolution, yeah, it is the monkey to man theory. Okay? So it's important that what people understand what evolution is. So from the biology perspective, that by itself is inaccurate from the Darwin stuff, because it was primates and the common ancestors with apes and da. But a monkey was not but that's the perception. And people would say, well, I have never, and people do respond, I have never seen a monkey turn into a man. And I reject evolution. Right? Now this is, it's an intuitive thinking. Yeah, I've never seen, so so that's it. But the other interesting one is that people say, well, it's against Islam. For some, again, I'm talking about those who reject. There are others who accept evolution. I'm talking about those who reject it. They say, well, it is against Islam. And that is interesting because for some, and we found that then in Indonesia, but we also found that a little bit in Europe, we find that for some, the definition of being a Muslim includes a rejection of evolution. And that is a tricky aspect to it. So for them, I mean, they're not looking at the philosophical challenges, all those tensions. Their answer is that here, that, well, I reject it because it is against Islam. Not I reject it because of a particular thing. Not I reject it because I don't like naturalism. I reject it because it is against Islam. So, but when we ask them, like, do you think can there ever be sufficient evidence to convince you otherwise? And for many of this subgroup, like you said, evidence has nothing to do with this. It is against Islam. So, this is just to give you a variety of responses of what is going on. So how to understand that? And this is something, the way to look at that is the cost of belief. And that is that, well, think about it. Religion is important, and especially in Muslim societies, religion plays a big role. Pew had a recent survey, how much religion is important. And yeah, people said, it's really important. All of your societal values are structured around Islam. And that's what you spend most of your time. And so, and here is, by the way, a completely non-scientific, I just put 99%, 99% of your time is spent on, with your religion, which includes family, culture, religion, and rituals, and it's all intertwined. Okay, then a researcher comes in, or worse, the Gallup calls you, okay, and says, what do you think about evolution? Do you accept it or not? Now just imagine, think about it. Right? For them, if their perception is that, well, accepting evolution means it challenges my religious values, which are 99% of the time, I would say no. That would be a reasonable response. Because it doesn't matter. What matters is the 99% of the things, and then some Gallup person calls me, and then I go like, does it matter? No, I'm not going to go out and say, no, I have to accept evolution because it's an accepted theory of science. No, because if it doesn't matter to me, then I would say that. Also, if rejection of evolution becomes a definition of being a Muslim, then it might become part of your identity. You don't want to give up that identity either. And that's a tricky aspect. For some people, especially about human evolution, it may become. So I just added those things that, because I find these, if you were to convince people about evolution, talk about flowers, not about apes. But anyway, when people don't talk about, when people are rejecting evolution, they're not talking about, there was a co-evolution of flowers and insects, and how did those evolve? Or, for example, whales, there were these spectacular fossils that were found in Pakistan and Egypt, and that's where we found out how whales evolved and so on and so forth. Or, for example, crayfish, the freshwater versus saltwater lobsters, how did they change? No, those are not the area of contention. People are not talking about, no, how did those crayfish evolve? No, that's not. So the issues are with evolution. People are also talking about a very narrow thing. Okay. Let me just sum it up, but let me sum it up with the practical applications business. Hajj is happening tomorrow. When is Hajj? Yeah, tomorrow, very soon. So 2 years ago, there was Hajj, and there was danger of H1N1 flu, also known as swine flu. Okay. Now in Saudi Arabia, as Elise had mentioned before, they reject evolution. But when it came down to come up with a vaccination business, okay, the flu strand was mutated. They had to come up with a specific vaccine, which was, and you can only do that on the basis of understanding the principles of evolution. Okay. Unfortunately, Saudi Arabia at that time did not have any labs on evolution. So what did they do? They didn't say, well, we don't accept evolution, so we don't care if it cannot be mutating. No, what they did was, they asked European and American labs, and they said, well, can you create a vaccine for us to vaccine that? And they did that, and actually that pandemic was saved. But that's a practical application. Well, the same thing happens when we ask Pakistani physicians in the US, for example, do you think theory of evolution plays a role in modern medicine? And we find that even those people who reject evolution say, oh yeah, it does. Okay. Here is a sample of Malaysian doctors and students. We asked them, do you think the theory of evolution plays a role in modern medicine? Even those people who actually reject evolution say, yeah, it does. So people think in a different way. So let me end by saying, these are my conclusions. Is there a clash between Islam and the theory of evolution, or Muslims and the theory of evolution? Well, first I would say it depends on one's definition of Islam and understanding the principles of evolution. There are widespread existing views. Okay? Many accept even human evolution. Okay? But there is a much broader acceptance of practical values. However, this is not how we see in the news or what we see are conflict cells. Okay, here is Harun Yahya, one of the creationists. Okay, we find that in Turkey he's not very important, but outside he has become quite important, especially in the Western press. Okay, but oftentimes when people are rejecting evolution, they are proselytizing. They are not being driven by curiosity. This is Zakir Naik, for example. And then the only Muslim voices we often hear are the ones who reject evolution, and this is Yusuf Qaradawi. Okay, so that's why I actually really want to thank American Islamic Congress for providing an opportunity for other voices to be heard, people who are Muslims. And I'll just end this. I want to end with a high note, and that is, we talk about, people think about, oh, stardust. Oh, this is like, we are all part of stardust. We were like, our atoms in our bodies were formed in exploding stars. The atoms in our right hand, for example, were part of one star, and the atoms in the left hand were part of another star, light years away. Okay. Well, those same atoms have also gone on to produce the DNA. Those same atoms have also recycled within the Earth. We also share a heritage with all life on Earth. So when we think of all of our connection with the universe doesn't stop at the Earth. The life on Earth is also part of this universe. And thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank also the American Islamic Congress for hosting this event, and I'd like to thank Salman for a very interesting presentation. I'm going to keep this short, but I'll just give you, I guess, my perspective as a Muslim and evolutionary biologist. So I practice evolutionary biology, that's my profession. I've spent well over 15 years now in the lab doing experiments and seeing evolutionary biology right before my eyes. And I guess I just wanted to give you, encapsulate my impression, and that is that there's not much that takes me away from the lab. You can ask my wife, my parents, except for when I've been doing experiments and not thinking too much about this conflict. I very much lived these last 15 to 20 years practicing Islam as a practicing Muslim. I pray 5 times a day. I do my Ramadan. Does that mean I have to stop now? So very much I've lived this way for the last 15 years, and it was actually Salman and Anila Asghar and Brian Alters when they started asking what the Muslim world started thinking about evolution, and finding out that there's an overwhelming rejection in many countries, and it's not just with medical doctors, but just in everyday life, including my own family and my own cousins, and if you just ask them, many misperceptions. And so what brought me kind of into action and started to talk about these issues is that for a long time, even independently, I started to put two and two together. For a long time, a lot of, originally my family's from Egypt, and many of the Muslim countries and Arab countries, are technological consumers. We don't innovate. And there's a lot at stake here because it's well beyond evolution. If, as Salman said, if it's not about the evidence, if you're not willing to, if you reject science, if you're willing to accept evolution as a science, and you're not willing to listen to evidence, then you also won't be, I mean, that means that for all of science, when it comes into contact with sociological, political conflicts, then you won't believe it either. And so there's a lot at stake here for the evidence of science and how we teach it and how we accept it. And then it goes on to a broader scale. Because, as Salman has also mentioned in his presentation, the Saudi government, when it came time to give the H1N1 vaccine, they weren't innovating. They're not the ones who produced it. They had to call other countries in the West to innovate. My calling, what I feel, why I'm speaking today, what actually got me to get out of my seat, of my lab chair, and to actually come here, is my want of the Muslim world to become innovators and share in being leaders in technology and innovation and share in production and not just be consumers. And that takes us to accept an organizing fundamental principle of biological science. If you pick up any biology textbook, the organizing principle of biology is evolution. And in that perspective, while I have to apologize to those physicists in the audience and astronomers, but Islam has been extraordinarily innovative in previous centuries in astronomy, in medicine, in physics, in mathematics, as goes to the root of the word algebra. And what's often said about the Muslim world, if you read sort of philosophy of biology textbooks, they say that Muslims, when it comes to biology, all they were they were able to preserve the teachings of Aristotle and pass that on to the Christians during the Christian Enlightenment. So not really innovators in biology. And maybe that didn't affect the Muslim world for a long time, but one may argue that now biology is the science of the 21st century, arguably, with my colleagues in astronomy and mathematics, but it has really become the science of the 21st century. And if we're not willing to accept the organizing principle of biology, we will continue to be consumers and be left behind. And that's all I have to say.
Thanks everyone. My name is Omar. I'm going to try to make a case for why Muslims shouldn't be afraid of evolution. And I'm going to kind of focus on the things that are at the core of philosophical disagreement amongst Muslims and within the popular understanding. So in the history of science, people often will react to new discoveries in interesting ways, but at the end of the day, people want to know whether things are true. And when you want to know when things are true, and not just whether they're what people think, you go to philosophers. And so while I think it's interesting to examine how people react on the ground, I think it's also more important to make the case, if it's possible to make the case, that it's not something that should be feared in principle. So first of all, it's important to note the Islamic tradition is notable for its openness to scientific inquiry in general. Muslims in general aren't afraid of science, historically as well as today. There's a kind of intuition that things are always compatible, that these things are going to mutually support each other, that your faith and your inquiry should support each other. And at a fundamental level, there's lots of evidence within the tradition that scientific inquiry is a way of understanding how creation works. So at a first pass, people should not be afraid of any form of scientific inquiry. And specifically not biology, given its importance. Secondly, evolution raises the question of the relationship between faith and reason. So, similar to the value that science is given in Islam, there's an intuition within the tradition that faith and reason are compatible. And this is kind of compatible with a lot of the ways Christian and Jewish philosophers have thought about the relationship between science and religion too. So there's tons of hadiths in this regard. Seek knowledge even if it's in China, or in the Quran. There's a passage that's relevant to today's discussion. Travel through the land and observe how God began creation. So kind of metaphorical, injunctive to actually try to figure out where everything came from. And I think it's helpful to notice the parts of the tradition that emphasize that faith and reason are both gifts from God, and that they're both kind of tools of perception in the world, that they can be complementary to each other. And so therefore, Muslims should have a duty to search for the truth and try to figure out what actually is the case. They shouldn't be afraid of scientific inquiry. They should, both normatively and in their history, recognize that these are things that should really matter and they have nothing to be afraid of. Now, what about the apparent contradictions between evolution and religion? So what I'd like to do is make the case that Muslims today can look for forms of philosophical thought in which there's compatibility, given the importance of incorporating biological knowledge into the Muslim world. So if you ask a lot of Muslims in America today, something like half or 40% of them will actually say they accept that evolution is the best explanation of where humans came from a 2007 poll. So even at baseline, American Muslims are kind of on to evolution. But I'm a psychologist and philosopher, so we know from studies that people, when they say they accept evolution, it doesn't correlate with whether they actually understand evolution. So if you're a scientist, unless you're like a professor or PhD in biology, most people who say they accept evolution really have there's no real correlation with whether they understand how it works. So for example, if I asked you if you accept evolution, and I said, well, do you think that closely related species share a common essence? So if I'm a pig and I'm a cow, we're kind of like each other. Do we share a common essence? Well, probably people would say, well, probably more than a fly and a pig. But in reality, all species share a common ancestor. Or if you ask more complicated questions about how natural selection works, like does a trait's heritability depend on its adaptive value? So will a trait get inherited as it relates to how adaptive that trait is? People say, yeah, traits will get inherited if they're adaptive. Well, that's wrong. So we can go into why that's wrong. It's really more based on the origin of the trait. That determines its heritability. So you might probably already getting confused, right? So as you can tell, it's really hard to understand natural selection. It's very counterintuitive. So 45% of Muslims do accept that evolution matters and explains, Muslims in America, sorry. So I think we need to convince leaders in the Muslim world that these things should be compatible, and then people will tend to believe these things just in the ways they also believe in religion, in the sense that for most people on the ground, believing in evolution is kind of like believing in religion. People trust authorities, they value kind of testimony. But why shouldn't there be any incompatibility? Well, I think there's a lot within the tradition which people can appeal to, such as that God is the ultimate cause of nature, is the final explanation of where everything came from in the first place, why anything exists at all rather than not existing at all. Why is nature law-like in the first place? Nature could have existed and have been just totally chaotic. And given its law-like nature, why are those laws comprehensible to us? Why aren't they just totally mysterious? These are the kinds of things that theists, Muslim theists can appeal to in trying to explain why God could be the origin of nature itself, as well as why philosophers are so fine-tuned for human existence. Why are the constants so narrowly constrained in how they can be defined for humans to exist? Now, after you get that out of the way, one way to think about evolution is that it's God's method of creation. It's the proximate mechanism by which the creation of life has unfolded on this earth to eventually create humans. So once you accept that the world isn't 6,000 years old, you have to wonder how you got here. And I think what Muslims can do is think of evolution as a proximate mechanism for how they got here. And think of God and creation as an ultimate mechanism. So it's not that you're a theistic evolutionist. It's not that you think God just started everything up. God is both the author of nature as well as its source. So laws of nature are not incompatible with God's working in the world. Finally, the apparent randomness of mutations often causes people trouble. So how to get here, it's all random. Things zig, or they zag, and then I'm here, and now my twin brother. Well, one way to fit this into the theology is to say the apparent randomness or chance that exists in nature is not the same thing as divine causality, in the sense that there's natural causality, but there's also divine causality. And divine causality can incorporate within itself natural causality. And what that means is that what we call chance and randomness must be a part of providence. It may not be apparent to us how that happens, but in some sense, if you believe in God, it must be a part of some ultimate providence. And whether this is compatible with evil and suffering, well, then now you're a philosopher. You're asking philosophical questions, right? But how to first fit in that conception into Islamic theology is the point. Finally, one could appeal to the fact that maybe nature is not exactly itself a mechanism. Maybe the analogy of nature as a mechanism is not a very good analogy to understand nature itself. To be a good scientist, maybe mechanism misleads us for understanding nature. There are indeterminacies, there are non-reductive elements at each level of explanation as you go from physics to sociology. And finally, as the philosopher Thomas Nagel has recently argued, maybe we need teleology or intention and purpose at the beginning of our explanations of nature and not just at the end. He, of course, is an atheist. He doesn't think that implies God exists. But my point is only to note that it might be interesting to think about whether the idea of mechanism itself is a compatible view within naturalism. And then finally, I think it's important to convince Muslims that you don't have to disregard the idea of humans as being special if you accept evolution. So biologists tend to emphasize the continuities of humans with other animals when they talk about evolution. We're just animals. But that doesn't mean you're just like your dog, because your dog doesn't put you, on a leash, right? So we are within the realm of nature, but we're also unique and distinct. So what I study is psychology of religion and morality, and intelligence and memory. And what you get from this field is that people really are different from other animals. We have capacity for symbolic representations. We can detach thought from raw sensory experiences. We can combine ideas in different ways to create new ideas. So I don't think Muslims have to give up the idea of humans being different or unique within the natural world. We're the only species that we know of that can think about its own self and its place in the universe. So I think it's a misnomer that we have to give that up either. And finally, I think it's helpful to appeal to the other traditions that have already taken on evolution as part of its theology. So Catholic Church in 1950, Orthodox Church, almost all Jews. So that's my kind of why Muslims shouldn't be afraid of evolution. Now, well, what I study is the psychology of religion, and so I study how evolution designed us to even produce religious thoughts and ideas and feelings, how religion works in social societies, how it leads to cooperation and violence, how our basic ways of thinking predispose us to having religious beliefs. So what I study is how evolution made us religious in the first place. So if evolution didn't exist, that shouldn't be a field of study. So it's really hard to deny that these forces are occurring on the ground. But I think Muslims shouldn't be afraid of these fields of inquiry either, because there are resources within the tradition for people to understand and incorporate this knowledge into their lives. So in Islam, there's an idea of fitra, right? That people are naturally religious, they're born believers. And this is analogous to John Calvin's idea of a sensus divinitatis, that your creator would instill within you a divine sense to perceive and know religious realities. And so if you're a religious person, you could say, what I study is the sensus divinitatis. If you're an atheist, you say, I study the psychology of religion. But this is compatible, I think, with at least some forms of Islamic thought. For example, one hadith is narrated as the Prophet is saying, no child is born except on the fitra, and then his parents make him Jewish, Christian, or Zoroastrian. As an animal produces a perfect young animal, you see any part of its body amputated. So the analogy is made between an amputated body part and atheism, in the sense that people are born naturally religious and they have to be converted out of it. And whether that itself, I think, has no philosophical relevance. It doesn't tell you what to believe, but it does tell you that, well, you can explain some certain things within how the mind works, and have that be at least somewhat compatible with the way Muslims have conceived their own place in nature through their theology. So what does this mean that we are born believers? Well, it's not that you're born into the world as a Mormon or a Jew. It's that you have certain capacities that predispose you towards religious belief and that are not learned and that are pre-reflective. And they're as basic to human nature as the intuition that I have that if I take two solid objects that can't pass through each other, or that you have a mind, and you're not just a mind adult, or that many other similar intuitions that are core and basic that we don't learn. And belief in God is like that. That's how basic belief in God is to people. So the idea that supernatural agents exist, that they have superpowers and super knowledge, that the natural world is intentionally designed by a supernatural agent. So if you ask little children, where do mountains and rivers come from, they don't assume they're made by people. They assume they were made by agents that have superpowers that are not people. That there's an afterlife. The idea of an afterlife is intuitively, it comes intuitively. It's not something you have to learn. Divine justice, whether it's this world or a next world or an afterlife, these four beliefs don't make you have a religion. You have to culturally scaffold them onto other beliefs. But they do explain our natural propensities for religion in the first place. This is not to, so again, it's not to say that theology itself is natural. It's to say that our basic forms of religion, our basic predispositions are natural. And they're obviously not due to psychopathology or being crazy. So I think that's kind of another point where you see a consonance between evolutionary biology and Islamic theology. So I'll close by just saying one of the ways to convince people of this is to invest in non-kind of applied sciences. So right now, if you go to the Muslim world, you'll see tons of people studying engineering and medicine, computer science, and various other fields. But where is the philosophy of physics and anthropology and biology? What we need to do is invest in fields that challenge people to produce more sophisticated, less dogmatic forms of religion. And that's it. So thanks a lot.
So we're gonna try. We have one person who's gonna Skype in to give her ideas for like 10 minutes, and right after that we're gonna leave it open for Q&A session. Okay. Our event is gonna last until 9 p.m. So please collect your questions, and then once we are done with the other 10 minutes to speak by Dr. Rana Dajani, right after that we will have it open for Q&A. We have our moderators in charge. Thank you guys. Rana, can you hear us? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Shall I begin?
Yes.
So my presentation is up on the screen.
No, just a second, Rana. As we
Okay, start.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and peace be upon you all. I'd like to thank the organizers for this event and inviting me to be part of this panel. I apologize that I couldn't be here in person, and thank God for some we could do this from far. As I begin my talk, I'm going to try to not repeat what was spoken before by the other panelists. So please bear with me if there is a little bit of repetition. Usually, in contemporary discussions in the West concerning religion and science, there appears to be a contradiction, at least for some religions. And this contradiction has somehow been transported to the Muslim world. And the most example
Microphone. So you wanted the next slide now?
Yes, please.
All right.
I can't see which slide is on. I just want to make sure I'm talking
on
on the
the-
same slide.
On the evolution.
There's a screen. Is that possible?
Okay, let me try it then. Can you see it?
Yes, excellent. All right, so before I go on, I want to make two very important points that I would like the audience to really make sure that they understand. So can you please go to the next slide? We are in the West now, and we are discussing Islam and evolution. All the people in the audience and even the panelists, we are coming from different backgrounds and different religions and different cultures. So misunderstanding can easily happen amongst us. So we must remember that there are perspectives where we may all be correct, but not necessarily there anyone who is wrong. There's no black and white. So to give you an exercise to really drive this point home, I'd like the audience to be divided in half. So please, I don't know, I think you're sitting in a big room, so if would all the people sitting on the right side of the room close their eyes, and only the people on the left side of the room to keep their eyes open. And I want those people whose eyes are open to look for 1 minute at the next slide. So would you please go to the next slide?
Who is closing the eyes and who is opening?
On the right side to have their eyes open and left side their eyes closed.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Close your eyes.
Open.
And no cheating.
Okay.
So if half of the people have closed their eyes, can we go to the next slide for them to look at, for those whose eyes are open to look at this image? Yes, so for 1 minute, those whose eyes are open, please look at this picture. Don't say a word, just look at it. And those whose eyes are closed, please remain closed. Now, for those whose eyes are open, please close them now. So everybody's eyes should be closed now. And Rima, could you turn to the next slide? And only the people, turn to the next slide, please. Now, only the people whose eyes were closed for the first minute to open it. Open them now, please. So now we have half the room with their eyes open, looking at this image for 1 minute, while the other half have their eyes closed. Okay, Rima, if you could go to the next slide, and everybody can open their eyes now if you've gone. Yes, now please, everybody open your eyes, and now look at this image. Now, as you're looking at it, I'm going to ask you a question. So how many people in the audience can see an image of a young woman? Please raise your hand, and if, Rima, you can count for me. Is it over half? Or
Over half.
can see a young woman? All right, now, would you please put your hands down, and how many people can see an old woman? Everybody can see both?
But I see less hands from the first time.
All right, so this is an exercise, and I'm sure in the audience you'll have people who can see both an old woman and a young woman, but you will have people who can only see the young woman, and people who can only see the old woman. Now, the reason what happened is, if you could go back to both pictures, Rima, could you just go slowly so everybody can see the two pictures? So half the people saw this picture of an old woman, and the other half, if you go to the backwards one, and the other half saw the picture of a younger woman. So for 1 minute, every person has been conditioned either to see the young woman or the old woman. And now when we go back, if you go back to the duplicate image, yes. Now, now when you, whoever's been conditioned, now when you look at this one that has both images, those who have been conditioned for 1 minute takes them a while to see the old woman. And those who have been conditioned to see the old woman will take them a while to see the young woman. So the drive home, or the take-home message from this is, how about a whole life of conditioning? Seeing the world through a particular lens, being brought up in a particular environment, in a particular community, with a particular outlook and perspective on life. How can you ever come close to understanding another person coming from another culture, another perspective, and acknowledging that that person may be correct? Because in this little exercise, both people were correct, those who saw the young woman and those who saw the old woman. So I just want to keep this message in your mind, that as we discuss things today or even in the future in your lives, to always understand that there's going to be another opinion, and that other opinion may be correct. Even if it's not correct, or at least respect that person and understand that he or she comes from a different background. All right, so to go to my next slide, please. The second message that I wanted to talk about, or point that I wanted to make, is that what is our role as humans on Earth? To me, it's about living in harmony with all creation. And all religions have come with this message. And if we look at one of the verses in the Quran, it says, "Behold, thy Lord said to the angels, I will create a vicegerent on earth." So somebody to take care of earth, to allow us to live in harmony with other humans and other creation. Next slide, please. And in order to live a life of harmony, we needed guidelines. So in Islam, we have the Quran, and the Quran is a guide on how to live our lives in harmony. It is not a book of science. It's a book of spirituality and how to carry out our social lives with other human beings and other creatures. Next slide, please. Within those guidelines of the Quran, it also tells us how to observe, and it encourages us to search for knowledge and try to explain the phenomena we see around us. So if we look at the verse, "Behold, in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the alternation of night and day, there are indeed signs for men of understanding." So the Quran asks us to look around. And if we go to the next slide, within we see the basis of the scientific method, where we are asked to observe, and then to think about explanations for our observation, which are hypotheses, and then to try to think of experiments to test our hypotheses, and then come up with results that would either verify our us back to the drawing board to try again. So this is what Islam asks of us as Muslims. Please, next slide. So along those lines, scientists have looked at the world around them and made observations. And these scientists don't just come from Islam, but from all religions. And in every case, they are seeking the truth. And whatever truth they come out is something good. So there's a hadith by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that says, when a judge gives judgment and strives to know a ruling, and is correct, he has 2 rewards. And if he gives judgment and strives to know a ruling but is wrong, he has 1 reward. So we are rewarded whether we are right or wrong. So we are rewarded for our intention of trying to explain what is going on around us in order to seek the truth. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I wonder, can you hear me? So I'll carry on until, is it flipping?
We can hear you.
All right. So, but you didn't change the slide, right?
Theory of evolution.
You're fine. So as humans, we've looked at different.
Don't hear you.
Your voice, you're going away. We can't hear you.
I'm going to go into the detail of what are the observations, what were the inferences that Darwin made, and through that the theory of evolution evolved, because that can be read anywhere, and the panelists before me have mentioned it one way or another. I just want to summarize the theory of evolution, that it is that species change over time, and that the species have all derived from a common ancestor, and that Earth and life are very old. These are the basic tenets of evolution, or the Darwinian evolution as we know them today. Next slide, please. Now, of course, there are some misconceptions about evolution that we should take care not to mistake. So first of all, natural selection does not lead to perfection. Natural selection is not random. It is non-random, but it is not progressive either. There's no higher or lower organism. Each organism is fit to its environment. So if the environment changes, this organism will change to be the most fit or the best fit for its environment. So there's no lower or higher or better or worse. Natural selection adapts populations to conditions that prevail in the past, not conditions that may occur in the future. These are very important points that we should keep in mind, which a lot of people misunderstand and so misunderstand evolution. And if you go to the next slide, please, we can see around us that evolution is a fact. Whether it's the artificial breeding of plants and animals that has been happening throughout history, or by the antibiotic resistance of bacteria that has developed, or by drug design for the influenza vaccine, as somebody mentioned earlier. So evolution is all around us. It's a fact that we cannot deny. It's not something that we have to believe or not believe in. It's a fact. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that even though it's a fact, and we use it, and it's all around us, the stand of Muslims today, if you go ask them, and as Dr. Salman Hamid mentioned, most people deny evolution, or don't believe in evolution, or at various degrees of understanding of evolution. And so this becomes scary, because of the fact that a sound scientific theory is so vehemently denied by Muslim scientists, let alone the layperson, on the basis of belief and not logic, is scary, because it makes one wonder what else is being denied in the name of religion and played upon by people who want to control others through ignorance and emotion. This position alienates the world of Islam from thinkers and also deprives the individual Muslims of the full use of their minds. In addition, it gives a terrible representation of Islam to non-Muslims, leading them to believe that Islam is a religion that denies freedom of thinking, when that is exactly the opposite of the truth. Islam calls for thinking, contemplating, and using logic to reach the truth. The verse in the Quran that says, "Behold, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, the alternation of night and day, there are indeed signs for men of understanding." So the question is then, why, if we go to the next slide, Muslims do not agree with evolution or do not accept it as a fact, while in the early history of Islamic civilization, a number of scientists actually thought about evolution and came up with theories that were, let's say, preliminary theories of evolution that were similar to some degree to what Darwin said. So how come those theories were accepted and nobody denied them their logic and nobody accused them of heresy? Well, today anybody who believes in evolution is considered to be an atheist or someone who denies religion. If we go to the next slide, I propose a number of reasons for this dilemma or this discrepancy in the past and today, and how this has nothing to do actually with religion as Islam in itself. On the contrary, it has something to do with other things. So the first reason is ignorance. So if we go back in history, first we've been living in the Arab world and the Muslim world. In all the countries we've been living under dictatorships who have prevented us from freedom and thinking and a good education. And if we go back further in history, we had colonialism that also stopped our education and encouraged ignorance. And if we go even further back, the end of the Ottoman Empire was very corrupt. We also lost a lot of education. So at least for 300 years in the history going backwards, we did not have, we lived in an era, it was the dark ages, if you could say, for the Islamic world. Now the second reason is lack of freedom. As I said, well, lack of political freedom. And of course, this lack of political freedom filtered down to lack of freedom in academia. And people could not think openly, could not question things, and so nobody thought about evolution or science in particular. The third reason is, of course, this is because of lack of understanding of Islam. Because as I just mentioned earlier, Islam and the Quran ask us to think, ask us to question, ask us to look around us and try to find explanations and to seek the truth. And all this resulted in lack of scholars who could actually understand the theory of evolution and understand that that has no contradiction with Islam. If we go to the next slide, I believe what happened when the Darwin theory, or when the Origin of Species was published, is that the church had taken a position against Darwin and had proclaimed that if one believed in Darwin, then that meant that that person was an atheist, and if you don't believe in Darwin, you're not. And the reason was based because if you take the Bible literally, Earth is and life are very young, so how could you interpret evolution in the light of the Bible? So what happened, and this is my opinion, is that Muslim scholars were very few, and scientists, there were very few for the reasons I mentioned before. So what happened is that the religious scholars adopted the standpoint of the church. It was a safe bet because the church believed in God, we believed in God as Muslims. If the church thought a particular theory was an atheist, then we should as well. And if we go to the next slide, actually the book of Darwin, Origin of Species, was not translated into Arabic until 1964. So how could one proclaim any opinion or judgment on a particular book when the book wasn't even actually read in Arabic? And also the reason for this controversy or this contradiction that I don't think should be present between Islam and evolution is terminology. So there's a lot of words going on, a lot of jargon that when translated into Arabic or translated into the Islamic context has a totally different meaning than that in the Christian or the Western context. So creationism for a Muslim means that there's a creator who is responsible for making the universe and all that is in it. That does not deny evolution or the presence of natural selection. On the contrary, Darwin himself did not say there was no God or there was a God. It was trying to explain how life emerged and how life evolved to the different kind of species we have today, and did not discuss the origin of life as such. And another reason for this contradiction is the misinterpretation of religious texts. So if we go to the next slide, if the Quran is taken literally, we may find verses that were interpreted within the scope of science known at that particular time. Now, as science evolved, the interpretation of the text also should evolve. So the interpretation of verses is relative. And I go back to the first point that I emphasized, that the Quran is not a book of science. It's a book of how we can live our lives spiritually in harmony with other fellow human beings. So I would like to give you an example, if we go to the next slide, of two verses in the Quran that well, before we go to the verses, I want to remind us of the sources of jurisprudence in Islam. So we have the Quran and the Hadith, and these, of course, we believe in them. We do not change them. We do not challenge them as texts, but we can talk about their interpretation. And here comes the third source of jurisprudence, which is ijtihad. And ijtihad is which means scholarly consensus. And this, unfortunately, has not been used for a long, long time. And this should be renewed, and Muslim scientists and Muslim theologians should go back and use al-qiyas wal-ijma' to try to reinterpret verses to understand in the light of scientific discoveries, in the light of modernity, in the light of the changes that are going on today in our lives. If we go to the next slide, I show you an example of two verses that were, and I'm using the English translation just to show how the English translation is reflecting the interpretation, which is, in my opinion, not correct. So the first one is a verse which says, "He who has made everything which he has created most good. He began the creation of man with nothing more than clay." This word "most good" in Arabic, it is ahsan. The verse in the Quran, or the word in the Quran, is the word ahsan. Now, the interpretation of ahsan, in this context, it was interpreted as most good. While ahsan does not necessarily mean most good. It could also mean the most fit, or the best fit. In another verse, we have the same word. We have in the second verse it starts, "We have indeed created man in the best of molds." In this context, best in the Quran, in Arabic, it is ahsan, so it's the same word. But in this case, it was interpreted as best, or translated as best. And even in the interpretation in Arabic, it is given the meaning of best, meaning something is better than another. Although ahsan could also mean the most fit. So here I argue that these are two verses using the word ahsan, that if I interpret ahsan in the light of scientific discoveries today, that is in the light of evolution as a fact, ahsan means the most fit. If I interpret the word ahsan in using science as it was 1,000 years ago, it means who is better. So this is an example of how many interpretations of verses of the Quran should be readdressed, reviewed, and looked at again in the context or in the light of modern discoveries of science. Can we go please to the next slide? So, to my knowledge, there's no actual problem with evolution. And if we look at the age of the earth, which is a contradiction or a problem for Christianity, in the Quran we have many verses that talk about the length of time, that God has been, that creating the heavens and the earth took a long time. So the verse here is that says, He regulates the affair from the heaven to the earth. Then shall it ascend to Him in a day, the measure of which is 1,000 years of what you count. So this is just a relative verse saying that it took a long time for earth to be made. So for Muslims, I don't think there is a problem or an issue with time. If we go to the next slide, Muslims in general, science states that the creation of the universe took billions of years. And this is a fact, as Dr. Salman Hamid talked about the evolution of the universe. Now, Muslim scholars do not claim that such a fact contradicts the Quran. On the contrary, they look at the verse that's written, He who has created the night and the day and the sun and the moon, they float, each in its own orbit. So there's no contradiction with the verse, and that the universe took billions of years to be created. So in that same sense, I ask, why can't we believe that also it took millions of years for life to evolve from one cell to the different millions or billions of species that we have today? Similarly, looking at the verse, He has created man from a clot. So here I'm using the word creation, or God, is using the word creation in both verses. In one, when we're talking about the universe, we accept that creation took billions of years. Why can't we accept in the other verse that creation also took millions of years to produce the different species we have today? So it doesn't have to be, when we talk about creation of living things, it doesn't have to be spontaneous or simultaneous. It could be something that took a long time. And I do not see any contradiction with the Quran or with Islam in that context. If we go to the next slide, so one must not note here that so there's no contradiction. Similarly, if we believe that God created the universe and life does not contradict evolution, similar to believing in God does not contradict the physical laws, that if you let go of an apple, it will fall because it is following the laws of physics. And actually, what I see in evolution is an elegant example that proves the presence of a God. Because the more, as we have learned in science, the more the explanation is simple, the more elegant it is, and the more proof that there is a God behind it. So in this verse it says, He who created the seven heavens in harmony, no want of proportion wilt thou see in the creation of Allah most gracious. So turn thy vision again. Seest thou any flaw? Again turn thy vision a second time. Thy vision will come back to thee dazzled and aware. So if we go to the next slide, and look at what even Darwin wrote at the end of his book. In his paragraph, he notes, if we go to the next slide, yes, yeah. In the last paragraph, in The Origin of Species, Darwin writes, there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been in our being evolved. Darwin never, in The Origin of Species, actually argued for presence or no presence of God. That's not the point. So in terms of evolution in Islam, there's no contradiction. Evolution just explains the laws that God put in place for all living life to be created, and not just that they were created simultaneously. They were created through a slow, gradual process of evolution according to specific laws of natural selection. So in that context, the only contradiction I would see if we are discussing is there a God or it's not, and that's not the idea of evolution. That's not the argument at all. If we go to the next slide, the only obstacle I would see is that of time. So
So for example, how to reconcile both. So for God there's no time. Time does not exist for God. There's no yesterday, today, and tomorrow. However, for human beings, we exist in time. We are limited by time. We have a yesterday, we have a today, and we have a tomorrow. So we are limited. So in some context, we may not understand how could have God created all creation through a period of time. At the same time, he has the capability to tell something, as it says in the verse, verily when he intends a thing, his command is be, and it is. So how could he say something to be, and at the same time it should take a long time? So here I can understand for someone to have a contradiction here, or have a dilemma, and this is the same dilemma in philosophy is, do I choose my destiny? So if God knows what I'm going to do, how is it my choice for me, or to control my destiny? So this is the dilemma I see, and I actually have an explanation for that. So if you go to the next slide, and we understand that we're limited. We have a limitation in our biology as we have been created. And this is an example brought forward by Carl Sagan in his book. So if we imagine ourselves ants, as you can see in the slide with the ants, if you go to the next slide. Now ants can all exist in 2 dimensions. And they only comprehend 2 dimensions. They exist of course, in this universe, so they exist in many dimensions, but they only comprehend 2 dimensions. So if you imagine yourselves as ants, and we live in a world of squares and circles, so if you're an ant walking along a 2-dimensional space, you reach the line of a circle. You can't go above the circle because you cannot comprehend that there's a top and bottom, or above and below, a z-axis. So you actually have to open the door of the circle and enter into the circle. And then you close the door behind you. You cannot leave that circle in any other way except in this 2-dimensional world. Now, if there's a sphere that is up in the air above the ant cannot see that sphere because it is not in the dimension that the ant can comprehend. Now, as the ball or the sphere is coming down, if it touches in the middle of the circle of this ant's house, from the ant's perspective, this ball is appearing out of nowhere, growing, and then when it bounces back, it's getting smaller and smaller and disappearing out into nowhere as well. So for the ant, this is something weird, scary, and it may start trying to make up explanations for this appearing and disappearing sphere or circle in its 2-dimensional world. So similarly, as humans, we are made of carbon. We have limitations in our biology that will limit our comprehension of more than 4 dimensions. And since God lives in a world that is not controlled by dimensions, then this is where I see an explanation for the no contradiction. So if we go to the next slide, sorry, I will hurry along. I'm almost done. If you go to the next slide, and this is how humans actually, when you don't understand something and you're scared, you start explaining it using metaphysics. So a long time ago, when people did not understand diseases, they actually thought it was bad spirits and so on. And even now, if you want to try to explain our conscience, if we don't even understand how our brain works, how can we understand the evolution of the brain? So if you can go to the next slide, and then the next. So in conclusion, and the next slide, please. I don't see any contradiction with Islam. And if there appears to be a contradiction, first we must revise the science, because science is always changing. The theories are put forward and then they keep changing. And here I call for to be creative in looking at evolution in the view of new discoveries. Also to review our tools, our scientific tools that we're using. These are also evolving as we go. And to keep in mind our limitations as human beings. If our science is concrete and we're sure of it, we can go to the Quran. If there's a contradiction, we should look at the interpretation of the Quran and reinterpret it again. And this reinterpretation should be done in the form of committees. Committees of people, not just theologians or religious scholars, but also scientists, and also people who are specialized in Arabic language to understand the multiple meanings of the words. Next slide, please. So this is a call for help. For everyone to participate in reviving Islam and reviving their reinterpretation and the ijma' and the qiyas. And to end, I always tell my students that they don't have to agree with what I say, but at least to use their brain and intelligence to examine the data, to analyze, and whatever they come up with is fine for themselves. I encourage them to trust their intuition and not to accept anything that does not make sense, even though it may seem contradictory to their beliefs. I tell them not to be scared, for if they are sincere in seeking the truth, they will find it. And lastly, I would like to end with this small movie. If you could put it on, Lima, and thank you very much for listening. It's a 1-minute movie. And this is just to show you the attitude when looking at things like this. So the take-home message is don't wait, jump in and do what you think is necessary to make this world a better place. Thank you very much.
So we're going to have the session open up for questions and answers, so please feel free to ask. Let's raise your hand.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please introduce yourself and say if your question is addressed to the whole panel or one of the speakers.
Oh, sure. Hakim Zaid, Harvard Medical School. I'm a fellow in genetics. And I must say that the theory of evolution, so even we are as human are evolved with time. So as we grow older, we accumulate mutations, so we evolve with, the cancer is a way of evolution as well. As the sister mentioned, also everything is evolved around us. But what I was not clear actually from the presentation is a different kind of evolution. So there was a paper in the Science magazine in 2010 was discussing actually how all of the links to evolution from the beginning of creation, and there was stated the chimpanzees and monkeys and how each link are linked together, and they actually the conclusion of the paper is actually the link is broken. So I need some help from you guys as evolutionary biologists to tell me. I'm convinced now about how we are evolved around us and the ones and the human by ourselves. But how is it how you link scientifically? I mean, you would like to convince someone that the monkey, for example, we are evolved from the monkey in just a very short term. Thank you.
So I think what I got, I guess I'll answer that question in short.
Yeah, anyone, it doesn't matter.
And I think what I understand from your question is a common question about microevolution versus macroevolution, maybe. The idea that many Muslims are willing to believe that microevolution happens so that within one particular form, changes occur over time. So bacteria evolve within a single form, humans evolve within their form, but transitions between forms is what is hard to explain. Is that kind of what you're getting at? The links, the transitional forms?
Yeah, if you phrase it that way, that should be fine too.
There's lots of evidence. So just to clear up, I think there was just a bit of a misconception in Professor Dejani's presentation of what evolution is. Just to say, when we say evolution, the difference between when people talk about the theory of evolution and when people talk about what is fact in evolution. So when we say what is fact, what we mean by fact is that there is descent with modification from common ancestors. So everything is linked together. That, we have so much evidence in the scientific community, that's beyond that.
Yeah, that's what I really like. What's the scientific, because I'm a scientist myself, so I would understand more.
So what we call theory, on the other hand, is the mechanisms of how all of that unfolded. So the pattern of evolution, the fact that everything descends as a tree-like structure, a tree of life, that is a fact. Theory is exactly what are the connections, exactly what the nature of those connections are, what are the mechanisms that are important. So natural selection by Darwin is just, the reason they call it a theory is because it's one mechanism of many that can explain this unfolding of evolution in a tree. Do we have evidence? Is there enough evidence to look at transitions between forms? There are plenty. I'm going to tell you one. For example, since you're a medical doctor, in the medical records you'll see many humans, for example, that are born with defects in which humans have ape-like hair, for example. There are many humans that are born with little tails, okay? And each of these have specific medical names. And it's not that. You have lots of snakes, for example, that actually have limbs, or whales with hind legs. There are many mutations that occur that reflect ancestral states, that are there in the genome, that reflect this connection of life. So, I mean, that's in short terms, that's just one piece of evidence among many, many other pieces of evidence showing the connections between ancestors and organisms.
Can the sister answer the question also, if possible? Give her take on that, Sister Rana.
Can you come closer?
She can hear me? No. Okay. Assalamu alaikum, sister. So my question regarding to the evolutionary theory. So I am convinced that evolution with mutations across species, that's a very factual thing. We see it around us. But my question is, how do you link actually across species? So for example, Dr. Hamid says that the theory from monkey to human. So how can you really convince someone scientifically that we evolved from monkeys? I know there are some people who believe that, but I just like to question how scientifically you just link this transition. Thank you.
So can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
First of all, humans did not evolve from monkeys. Monkeys and humans are cousins. They evolved from a common ancestor.
Very common mistake. So it's like you can't say you came from your cousin. You and your cousin have a common grandfather. All right? So that's the first point. So it's not that humans came from monkeys. Monkeys and humans are cousins. They share a common ancestor that was present millions of years ago. Now, how do you convince someone that humans and monkeys evolved from a common ancestor? The most prominent or the most strong evidence is from molecular biology, from our DNA. And as Dr. Lihab just answered the question, if you look at certain parts of the genome of monkeys or apes that are very close to us, who are related to us, they are very close cousins, there's so much DNA, so many genes in common, and actually there are some mutations that are present, they're very old, and they're... And then there are things that are present in... There's no denial to the fact that that species evolved from species. It took a long, long time, but it did happen. The DNA is the best proof for that, unless somebody comes up with a better explanation. At this time and point, that's the best explanation that we have up till now. And as I said, I don't see any contradiction with religion. And if you want to question it, you should question it as a scientist, not on the basis of belief.
Okay, great. Can we take another question from the audience? And I'd like to open it up to as many people as possible. So let's just ask one question per person if we can. Yusuf?
I have a question for all the panelists, so is it okay if I come up here?
Yes, please do.
Thank you all for doing this talk. You all give a lot of evidence on how you understand the theory of evolution, and you're able to reconcile it with your faith as a Muslim. And me as a Muslim, I also believe that humans evolved from a common ancestor with the apes. But there's two verses in the Quran which I have particular reconciling with human evolution. So I just wanted to see what your interpretation of these two verses are. So the first one is Surah Al-Imran, ayah 59. It says, "This similitude of Jesus before Allah is as that of Adam. He created him from dust, then said to him, be, and he was." So what I understand from this verse is that Jesus was created without male intervention and without an act of conception, and therefore Adam was also created without an act of conception. But according to evolution, you would be saying that Adam did have parents because he was part of this evolutionary chain, and so there was an act of conception. And then also in Surah Al-Isra, ayah 61, it says, "Behold, we said to the angels, bow down unto Adam. They bowed down except Iblis. He said, shall I bow down to one whom thou didst create from clay?" So it seems like here, before Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Paradise, God had created him from clay. And so there wasn't really a chance for evolution to occur before he was kicked out of the garden. So I'd just like to get your interpretation on this. Thank you.
All right, so first of all, like I said, you read the verses in English, of course. It's very different when you read them in Arabic. Because what you're reading is a translation, and depending on the scientific knowledge of the translator, he used particular words. That's one. Two, these are literal interpretations. When you say dust and clay, I mean, to me, that could be the elements that make up our DNA, that make up all living things, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and they are part of clay. So if you take it literally, you can say, okay, there was a piece of clay and man was created. And if you take it, no, not literally, but in a reinterpretation, saying that the basic elements that make up clay also make up human beings. I mean, as simple as that. I'm not doing any interpretation. As I said, to interpret, you need a committee, you need a group of people, you need theologians, religious scholars, you need scientists, and also you need people from the Arabic language to sit together and do this interpretation. I'm not an Arabic language specialist, nor am I a religious scholar. But it would need all three groups and any other who think they are stakeholders in this topic to address these issues. In the end, the Quran, as I said, please remember, it is there to guide us spiritually. So the story of Adam, the story of Jesus, are there to guide us how to be better people. They're not a scientific explanation of how we were there. So it could be Adam was a representation of humanity, not that he was the first human. Okay, I mean, I'm just throwing out other ways of looking at things. We don't have to take it literally. The Quran is not a book of science.
All right, another question for the sake of, yes, please.
Just to add something very quickly to that. I went through, again, I'm not an expert, but again, as somebody who practices evolutionary biology and Islam, I'm obviously looking for, things that would be consistent, at least consistency. I mean, in my own terms, I think these two worlds should be kept separate. I'm not going to go into why or how for now. We'll leave those for other questions. But the idea is, when I went through and I looked at all the surahs in the Quran that mentioned creation, there were mentioning of creation from several sources, from dust, from clay, from a leech-like clot of blood, from water, okay? There were many different sources, and even in some surahs, they even put them in some sort of order. First from dust, then clay, then a leech-like blood clot, indicating that it wasn't a single source, and that in some surahs they actually order the sources, meaning that it's consistent with some sort of not a single instant of creation, that there were several stages potentially of creation, and this would be consistent. There's a consistency in creation.
If I can just add a short point to that, and that is, as I think Dr. Shani mentioned actually briefly, this is a particular 20th and 21st century issue where we are looking at these texts and trying to correspond to a scientific way. And that happened sort of in the late 19th century, and then it has continued. People did not interpret it that way before. Meaning to say that they did not take it, oh, this is exactly the word means and this is how it corresponds to science. I mean, you can pick, this is, you mentioned evolution, you can pick other verses as well. But some we take professors, some we take sort of a metaphorical, and some we don't. And so that was the problem.
But the second thing, I think, the key aspect, where I a little bit disagree with Dr. Dajani, and that is there is also another trend in the Muslim world in general, and the world in general, of personal interpretation. So I think one of the things that is going to be an important thing of who has the authority to interpret, right? So that are the scientists, is the committee, but I think that will be and in fact, I was talking to Dr. Umar actually before we talked about it, that some of these evolution debates, when it happened in the late 19th century, they were part of the battle about professionalization of science. I mean, we think that scientists, there have always been biologists. No, they were natural philosophers. Or they were natural historians, actually. A lot of biologists would fall into natural historians. So there was professionalization happening, and that was the question of who has the authority to interpret. And I think that kind of debates are now coming up in the Muslim world, where the education levels are higher. Mass education is coming. Now people are figuring out, okay, when it comes down to issues of science, who gets to interpret? And I think that's a fascinating question academically.
Excellent. Is there anyone who has a question that's not specifically related to interpretive theology? Okay, very good. All right. I think you in the middle had your hand up first.
I just have a comment. Like, I feel that some people are like, as Muslims, are biased towards disbelieving or disregarding the whole evolution theory. I believe that scientists as well, like, they are biased towards tweaking the Quran to fit the theory of evolution. Like the gentleman just mentioned an ayah, like, or a verse in the Quran that mentioned both, like God created from the clay and dust and soul, and at the same time he mentioned in the same verse that when God, like in the same verse, it says that Adam is like Jesus. He didn't have a father, and he was just created from clay and so and blah blah blah. So if we disregard the part of being created from clay or that, we cannot disregard that he doesn't have a father like Jesus, and it's so clear. We couldn't interpret it any way else. So I believe still we have the conflict between Islam and between evolution in this part. Like the gentleman just mentioned that Muslims believe in evolution, and they don't just believe in the evolution of humans, and that's why we don't believe in evolution of humans, because we have this clear verse and we cannot just disregard it.
Okay. Do you have a question? Or
I think if any of the gentlemen can...
if I can just say, I actually had data which actually shows that people do accept Muslims. Some Muslims do accept human evolution.
No, I mean for the people who don't accept it, that's why they don't accept it. I'm not saying I accept it or not. I'm just saying why they're not accepting it. And if you have an answer to this part.
Sure. Actually, people do not. So when we have asked these questions and we ask actually why they reject evolution, very few people actually mention specific quotes from the Quran.
Yeah,
usually people give, right, but very few people mention actually specific quotes from the Quran, even when they are rejecting it. Usually it is, again, as I mentioned, it's a much broader thing, like that this view that it is against Islam. Actually, if you ask them, in fact, we also ask the question whether people have read the Quran or not. Okay, a lot of them haven't. Okay, they say actually, no, I haven't read the Quran, but I reject evolution because of Islam. Right, so it's actually a little bit more complicated of why people reject evolution. Actually, it's oftentimes people are not specifically looking at it theologically or looking at it from explicit text purposes, but rather a generic idea of why it would be against Islam.
Yeah, but because we didn't, like, if we don't read the verses specifically as you mentioned, but we're raised on the belief that God created Adam. Like, it's like even a story it's been told to us when we were young, 1 or 2 years. So you cannot just tell them it's not he didn't create him. He was evolved from apes. So that's the like, as if you're telling them he's not your father. So, you know.
Thank you. We have the gentleman in the back first.
Hi. I would like to make some comments because I think some of the statements that were made, in my view, that incorrect. When we think about the theory is just an explanation of a phenomenon. And therefore, what we can do with science, using the data or other means that are fact-based to reject the theory. So data can reject the theory, but a theory by its nature can never be accepted. So all what we can say about a theory is an explanation that has never been rejected because we didn't have the data, but at the same time, by its nature, it cannot be accepted. And therefore, when I hear, for instance, some scientists say, this is a fact, they are confusing a fact with a theory, an explanation in their mind with a theory. The second element that they are making is I'm actually surprised that they are accepting a theory. Finding a consensus about a theory doesn't mean that it's accepted as a truth. And therefore, what could we do with these theories that are out there? They can be, of course, useful for educational purposes and for our mind, for our evolution. They are definitely useful. The other part of this scientific process, not the theoretical part, but the data part, what it can tell us is we can have facts and data that maybe reject some explanations that are in religion. You can have some religious books that claim to be a religion that explains certain things, but at least if I come to science and I have facts that tell me that this is contradicted by facts, and facts are, we observe them, therefore they can be useful to theory. But I think here, in my view, as a comment overall, that the scientists who say they accept and they go even beyond that point, and they want others to believe in their explanation, they are, in my view, going beyond what they are supposed to do. They are asking people to believe in evolution as if it is a religion. And it is not a religion, and it shouldn't be. And I would like to hear some comments maybe on particularly the scientists or the statements that were made that scientists accept this theory or this theory is a fact. These, I have heard these statements and I am not in agreement with them. So I would like to hear some comments.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to all of the participants here, all the audience. With all due respect, this is a question and answer session. We are here to take questions for our distinguished guests who are scholars. We are not here to accept statements. Thank you.
So, everyone, please,
Excuse me,
raise your hand, have a question.
No, please, if I can, this is an academic debate, if I can just answer. This is...
Please ask your question.
My question is actually somewhat, I feel that a bit of an elephant in the room, in the sense that here's a radical notion for you. The Muslims, the multiple Muslims and multiple Islams out there, maybe we got to a point in history is that what do we care what the learned and the ulama say about science? Why do we need them to begin with? And this is a feature of enlightenment that, with all due respect to all religious faiths, science is facts, tangible, empirical. What the Quran says, what the Bible says, old stories in an old book. Yes, holy, but maybe it is time for us to just like bypass all of that and basically stick to science as a way to enlightenment. That's a provocative way of framing it, and I don't want to deliberately put it to.
So the question is, why do we care what the ulama says? Actually, that's where I was referring to the question of authority, right? And in fact, so there is a history of where ulama's powers have lied in the past. And in fact, if you look at, so I come from South Asia, so from Pakistan, and in fact, the decisions regarding our understanding of science, ulama have no say. The only place, in fact, one of the debates that actually I'm really interested in is the issue of the Islamic calendar, of who looks at the moon, who gets to verify it. Now, that's a fascinating question. And where astronomers say, well, we know when the moon is going to be, and the ulama says, no, but it's an Islamic calendar, so we get to choose. Well, this is a particular battle that is taking place. And if you are talking about medical schools, which is also science, I mean, it's applied science, but it is science. People are not going to the ulama to ask, for example, whether and for antibiotics, whether natural selection works or not. No, it is already being bypassed. So I think there is a complex history of why that is the case, and some of it in South Asia has to do with the colonialism also, the British structure, the way the structure is formed. So it is part of that where the ulama who were the most educated in the 18th century, up until the 18th century, are no longer the most educated, right? So there is a history of a colonial history associated with that, and That's where some of the debates that took place in the 19th century Europe, where the clergy, which were also very educated and experts in that, that's when their power got limited by a number of professional scientists. And there is some overlap, but science became professionalized. And so that's where the question is coming in today. Are the questions about what you are referring to will be the professional biologists, authority, or are they going to be, for example, I mean, does he have to have a beard, for example? Like, so no, he can do it. But you know what I'm saying. But yeah, but that's a fascinating question.
I mean, just to, and I'll probably pass this to Omar to answer this philosopher, which is, you know, the limits of science as well. So, I mean, one of the things that I have spoken about in the past is that, of course, there's no scientific experiment you can do to prove or disprove Allah. I mean, the existence of there's just no, so immediately takes it out of the realm of science. And, you know, when I'm feeling sad because I've lost something in my life or somebody has passed that I dearly love, I don't turn to my experiments for an answer. And so there are limits to science. And, you know, yeah. So I'll pass this then, you know.
So yeah, so the first reason you have to engage people on their own terms is because if you don't, other people will, and they'll change their minds in ways that are less productive. And so if you give up on people as a practical matter, you're going to have horrible social outcomes, as we already do. Secondly, related to your answer, I think you know, the science itself is neutral on a lot of things. So philosophers have been trying for many centuries to get norms out of facts, and it just doesn't seem to be very easy. So you're not going to be able to build stable, harmonious communities with moral values just by appealing to what is the case. And which leads to this gentleman's question, sort of, which is, are these just theories? Well, of course, all scientific observations are theory-related. You have to care first about observing things in the first place. You have to respect norms of logical non-contradiction and so on. But given a certain set of observations, there are alternative theories that are more or less adequate, logically adequate. So the hypothesis is that this particular theory about natural selection, which could wind up being modified or, you know, being amended in some way, is the best theory that fits the present set of data. And so if someone wants to reject that, they have a burden to produce an alternative explanation that more adequately fits the data. Lacking that, we have no reason to respect your opinion. So that's how science works.
And Dr. Dejani wanted to comment on the question as well. The connection is still.
Brennan, can you hear us?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit garbled. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Can I comment on the question?
Go ahead, please.
One is that although science is very rigorous and has its own methodology, and as I said, the religion and Quran is about how to lead our lives as, with humanity, but at some point there will be an issue of ethics, which religion will help us to set the guidelines on how to do our science. And one of the issues that had a very prominent discussion was using human embryonic stem cells or not. So in this context, sometimes, no, we have to go back to religion in order to be able to distill or draw upon, to create guidelines on how to conduct our science in an ethical way that will not harm humanity. So it's all in the context of humanity and how to live in harmony. So that's one point. And the second point is the beauty of Islam. Although you have ulama and scholars and they tell you what they think and what they do, they may err, they may make a mistake. And second, you as a human being in front of God are responsible for your own conscience and your own logic. So you can, if you reach a certain logic and you feel comfortable with that, that's okay. There's a hadith which says, استفتي نفسك ولو أفتوك. يعني consult yourself even if others tell you to do something else. And this is the beauty of Islam. You don't have to respond to our alim. Alim is not it's not like the priesthood where you have to respond to a priest. It's just between you and your God. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we. Did you still have a question?
Yeah.
You, sir, first. Yes.
Hi. I guess my question is to Salman and Omar, addressed to you. So it's interesting that you mentioned, like you went through and you talked about the schools and how it developed, the textbooks developed. So is that like a phenomenon? Because I feel like Islam isn't necessarily very clear on like she said, it's very vague on the whole, like there's no storyline per se to evolution, and like it's not a empirically driven story like the Bible is, sort of. It's not a narrative, right? So you can't like go into it and be like, it starts here, it ends here. So is this like a historical phenomenon where like sort of we just lifted whatever our particular legacy was, like maybe the British, or we just sort of imported it, and it just became part and parcel of the education system?
Yeah, so it's, oh, sorry.
Yeah, no,
So this is a textbook question. I mean that's, so by the way, you're absolutely correct. I mean, one of the differences, again, it's like, unlike the book of Genesis, where you go book 1, book 2, book 3, and then people can argue about these things. The references to creation in the Quran are all different places. And so you cannot, and that's one of the reasons actually people cannot pinpoint a specific verse. Actually, we don't find a specific thing that people talk about. Now, I know that in Pakistan, I know a little bit more about the history of textbooks, and so in often cases, yeah, I mean that's the standard education curriculum they are using, and influenced by the previous system, and that might be British. But I should mention that it's not just limited to that. In Pakistan, it is not an issue of controversy. Is it? I mean, so within the U.S., there is a debate about whether textbooks should include that or not. In Texas, for example, or there was case in Pennsylvania before, Dover, Pennsylvania before, and there is a particular context within the U.S. why that is there, and that has to do with the political, like evangelical movement and so on and so forth, right? Well, in Pakistan, it is not an area of controversy. Now, people assume that a lot of people actually reject evolution, but as you saw, actually, those Pakistani doctors actually, a lot of them accepted it. It is in textbooks. It's not an issue. I've also interviewed. There is a Natural History Museum of Pakistan. And it's in Islamabad. There is an exhibit on evolution. And it actually includes human evolution. So I actually talked to the curator about that. That, well, that's a state-sponsored museum. So it's not just textbook case, right? State-sponsored museum. He said, yeah, it is there. And so I asked him, so how does he communicate? Does he get into any trouble with that? And he said, actually, no. He said, actually, teachers from all over Pakistan actually come to the museum, because it's a state museum. People from all over Pakistan actually come for training. And he said sometimes he gets weird remarks, but mostly those are people who reject, teachers who reject evolution, mostly from the northern areas, the tribal areas, and so that's much more conservative. But he said otherwise people come in there and they do that. I asked him if there was any government pressure to change the exhibit. He said he's never heard of it. He said nobody cares. So part of the reason why some of these things are there is that people don't care. And that's, for this particular thing, it's a good thing. And if I can give you an anecdote about the moon issue. Just last Eid, the one after last Ramadan, actually there were 3 Eids, there were 3 different Eids, so that's the end of Ramadan festival, and they were on 3 different days because people couldn't agree upon. So there is an actual committee led by the ulama, and there were other ulama who disagreed with that committee. And then there was another group of ulama who disagreed with that. So there were actually 3 Eids in Pakistan. Now, there is a one state sanctioned moon sighting committee. The opponents of that, which were also ulama, said the problem with this is that we're not involving astronomers. Now, the thing is that astronomers have no authority in there. But what was fascinating was that the struggle was between the ulama, and so one ulama group said, the problem with this ulama group is that they are not scientists. So sometimes inaction can actually produce, or irrelevance can produce wonders. And this is one of those cases that perhaps, because evolution is not an issue, if it becomes an issue, that would be a different case, but it's not.
And just to jump on that point, since my area of research was textbooks for some years, I want to talk about this historical contingency because it's a great thing. So as we're talking about the British system, for example, and systems of education and the formulation of these textbooks, Iran, for example, started with the French system when they first began to have a modern secularist education system which contained evolution in a sort of unproblematic form. And it was maintained in this way until well after the Islamic Revolution. In fact, it was as though they didn't notice it, had no idea that it could be problematic. And then in the late 1980s, actually, for a period of about 10 years, evolution as a topic remained in the textbook, but Darwin, any mention of Darwin, completely disappeared. And yet suddenly, he was rehabilitated somehow at a time which happened to correspond with Khatami's election as the prime minister, and he was opening the dialogue of civilizations with the West. So one of the interpretations I offered for why this happened, if evolution was still in there, but somehow Darwin became temporarily problematic, I suggested that it was just because he was a Western scientist. And so there are issues about, as you were alluding to, colonialism, anti-Western, anti-imperialist feelings. So it's not always about theology. I think we should point that out.
Wouldn't you, maybe I'm more sorry.
Okay, are there any other questions first? Yeah, you were first.
Is there any correlation between levels of education and evolution?
In what we see over there? Well, we don't have enough data to do that. So first of all, I mean, we are looking at the most educated. We started with the educated elites in the oral interviews. Would we expect that type of a difference? I don't know. But most often, and actually one of my students is here, Juliana is here, and she's interpreting these questions about human evolution, and so we'll find out what we see. Oftentimes when even, and I think Dr. Umar also mentioned that, and Nia also, that even when people accept evolution, oftentimes it is not based upon their thorough understanding of evolution. So we are trying, so one way of sort of like tackling that question is to see if whether they accept or reject, is that based upon their understanding of evolution? And these are highly educated, so perhaps that may provide us with an answer. But you saw the Malaysian sample, for example. I mean, only one doctor out of 30 sample accepted human evolution. So in that sense, is there a difference between education? My guess would be, I mean, even the most educated ones, and these are the educated elites, human evolution was an issue. So it's unclear whether better, like higher education, without tackling some other issues, like the threat to religion, for example, whether that is going to twist it or not. However, there is a difference between when people understand practical examples. So those people who gave practical examples which they had seen as a medical doctor and stuff, they did accept the highly microbial evolution and also general evolution as such.
Oh, no.
Oh, sorry.
No, there is a correlation with evolution, with education and acceptance of evolution. Some proportion of that is probably due to actually understanding it, while the majority of it is actually due to free trust as a kind of giving testimony about what to believe. So Catholics just all of a sudden started accepting evolution. It's not because they all of a sudden figured it out. They, they trust the Pope's word. In the same way, if your hero is like Richard Dawkins or something, most people who convert to atheism, they start being heroes too. And so there's probably both factors at play. And I'm not sure which is more strong or prominent, but there is definitely a correlation. So maybe educated people have different heroes, and probably both factors at play.
Right, so Dr. Dujani would like to comment and then.
Yes, so to comment on that question, I think it goes deeper than education. It's actually about freedom of thinking. I think when you're in a country where you have more freedom, people will have the courage to explore what they think is right and wrong and seeking the truth, and they explore their logic and they have more confidence, and so they will be better able to comprehend evolution and accept it. And of course that comes with education, but basically it's freedom. Because like, for example, in the Arab world you have a lot of education, but you do not have freedom. And that's very important. I tell my students, when they start the course, they just want to use what they learn from the ulama and the scholars. But when I give them the support and the courage to think on their own, which is freedom in that sense within the classroom, then they start exploring ideas and they come to different conclusions. So I think the bottom line is actually freedom. Thank you.
Now you, sir, at the end had a question?
Yeah, I just like to ask Ms. Rana.
Can you please come here?
Oh, walaikum salam. Well, the question is for me. I didn't hear that one. Yes, go ahead.
I think you know the Quran concepts better than me.
and I would like to ask you what you think about the concepts Bashar and Insan.
Oh, good question.
Yeah.
I avoided talking about human evolution because that's a whole different lecture.
Yeah. Because we are talking about human evolution, not personal evolution. And I think this difference is very important to understand of the talk of Islamic civilization, Islamic thoughts about evolution. Bashar and Insan, if you could describe that, I would be very happy. Thank you very much.
Well, of course, in this context, one would have to relate the verses, which I do not have in front of me. But of course, there are some verses that use the word bashar, and there are some verses that use the word insan. And these are two different things. And there are some interpretations could be, I mean, these are just suggestions, that one word, al-bashar, it could be that it's just a human without the involvement of the soul and the brain and the conscience, and insan, or vice versa, I'm not sure, is the terminology that describes the fully developed human being. So this goes back to the fact of human evolution, that probably humans evolved first, from like RD, the closest ancestor between us and apes, and then this human slowly, the brain evolved, and then at some point there was a conscience, and so on. So probably the first human-like thing was the bashar, and then the insan, or vice versa. So one could interpret the verses as well. And a very nice website that one could go to, and I could send it over, is done by actually a couple, a woman and a man, and they called it True Net Evolution, and they actually discuss human evolution. And they go as far as saying that using verses in the Quran to support that humans are evolving now. لو شئنا بدلنا أمثالكم تبديلا. If God wants, He will exchange you people with other people. And they took this as a meaning that humans are evolving all the time, even as we go forward into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to prioritize questions that don't require Dr. Dajani to interpret Quran on the spot, please. So refer those to questions that aren't about that, please. Yes.
I guess I could discuss this to Dr. Dajani and also on behalf of you were talking about how, especially like Saudi Arabia, many Muslim countries are technological consumers and are innovators. You guys made reference to kind of the golden age when there were many people thinkers, and I'm just wondering if you think, I mean, obviously, that was a long time ago, things were very different, but do you think it's a realistic goal for it, or for at least for Muslim countries to become innovators again and then be self-sufficient in that area?
All right, Rana, would you like to answer first?
Especially now and today in this modern world where the whole world is becoming a global village through the internet, it's very difficult to think of an isolated country or community or or group of scientists. I do science in Jordan, but I'm in constant connection with what's going on in the US and the UK and everywhere around the world, in Japan. So you cannot project the past on the future. It's a whole new playing field where anybody could be a scientist anywhere in the world if they have the expertise and they have enough money for the technology. So I think anything is feasible.
So, I mean, I think the biggest problem facing the Middle East right now, in terms of what's keeping them from innovating, is the lack of pursuing basic science. And so I've been following recently with the Arab Spring through Nature Middle East and other commentaries and blogs, what different leaders, like for example the Egyptian election, what the Egyptians, they've been talking a lot about science and what they expect from science, and also in Jordan, the Minister of Science, and what they were talking about essentially is basically we want from science to solve this problem, that problem, this problem, that problem. That's what science is for. Science should give to us, okay? And it should have purely practical utility. And this comes to something that Omar had finished his talk with, and so maybe you can comment after me how you get to this point. But I really think that the route to getting there, so for example, evolution, although has very many practical applications, as has been seen, to really understand the mechanisms is a purely basic science type of pursuit. And if we don't accept evolution, then you will never go into these types of things. You'll stay purely practical, you know. And if you're afraid that, for example, this chase after the other things that we haven't talked about, of course, is the Higgs boson, which has created lots of discussion about the God particle and these kinds of discussions. I mean, they didn't chase after the Higgs particle because, or the Higgs boson because they thought that that was going to cure cancer, or that they thought that that was going to solve, you know, some major practical. That was a purely basic science, but maybe many countries are shying away from that because they don't want to go deeper into. They don't see the practical utility of that. So I think really the route to innovation is to engage in these basic philosophical sciences, again, that don't necessarily have pure practical application.
Can I add a point to just very quickly? I refer you to the worldview essay in Nature I wrote last year, and it was actually discussing that point. Why don't we have the development of science in the Muslim Arab world? So it's not a matter of money. We have a lot of money. It's not a matter of brains because there's a lot of Muslim scientists in the U.S. doing great science. So actually it's a matter of bureaucracy and management. So because we do not have freedom, because people are in jobs because they are there because they know someone, not because they are accountable. So you cannot do good science because you can't spend the money that you have for a grant. Because somebody up there said, why do you want to buy this or why do you need this? So everything becomes stagnated, becomes very slow. And so these are practical issues. And the solution is when you have freedom, you vote into office the person who is accountable, who actually deserves to be in that position, and so science will move. So I don't think it's a matter of religion, or in that sense, it's actually a matter of having freedom. And this is not just for the Arab Muslim world, but all over the world. Lack of freedom will prevent anything and everything.
All right, thank you. I think we only have enough time for about 4 or 5 more questions.
Can I just say one thing, which is that I think the key is actually religion in the sense that if you have more liberal interpretations of the Quran and a different ontology of what the Quran is, where it came from and its history, you'll be more likely to not get stumbled. You wouldn't need a panel like this, right? If people kind of understood that you can interpret the Quran in a metaphorical, poetic way, and you wouldn't really have these stumbling blocks. And so I think the key is actually religion and having a different conception of Scripture. That'll open things up. And a sign of that is that most of the questions today have been about exegetical things. And those questions would really not be an issue if you had a more broad conception of Scripture. So I think religion is actually really important.
So I see 4 hands up. Those are the last 4 questions we're going to take. And can I please ask everyone, I'm just going to call on you, please give all your questions at once, and then we'll have the panelists answer them, because I want to make sure everyone's question gets heard. Please, no comments right now. Just state your question quickly as possible, please. So you, sir, first, and the lady.
Everyone. First, I want to thank you for the amazing actions, and then I want to just draw a conclusion. So, should we explain science to the religion, or should we explain religion to science, or it should be a complete separation between the two? And one more question to Sister Anna. When you say freedom, I think you are thinking of freedom, but at the same time you are limiting yourself through Quran, that everything at the end should be explained by Quran. So although I don't believe in this, but I just want to know how you think.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, next question. Okay.
My question is there an actual genetic link between the other pre-human or subhuman species and humans? And so I guess my question is more about the human evolution, because I don't find a contradiction in the Quran with animal evolution, because there's a verse that states that all life came from water. So that's my question.
Thank you very much. And then you here.
Yeah, so my question is, if this problem between sort of Islam and science, this constructed tension, is a two-way street, and we have talked a lot on the religious aspect. So what do we do? How do we deal with people who see religion inherently as anti-scientific? How do we address even sometimes state policies that construct this image? How do we deal with people like that on this particular question?
Thank you.
I had the same question.
Okay. So do you have a question?
So I'm hearing kind of two camps here. I'm hearing some people who are kind of, showing a lot of emotion, feel that, we can either make our own interpretations, kind of ignore 1,400 years of scholarship and inquiry on how certain verses of the Quran are interpreted. I think some people see the presentation we took as kind of like an apologetic form of trying to make evolution fit into the framework of our religion. I think others, me being in science myself, I'm a medical student, I studied evolutionary biology.
Yeah. My name is Professor Ehab Abouif. I'm at McGill University. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Evolutionary Developmental Biology, and I've been studying evolution for over 15 years. I've been an experimental evolutionary biologist for over 15 years. It was an honor to participate in this event today. It was really stimulating to understand what concerns people have, to be able to respond in part to those concerns, to challenge some of my own, they challenged some of my own views, as well as reinforced some of the views that I had. And with the amount of discussion and the number of questions that were there today, and even the differing views between panel members, to some degree, the consensus and differences only reinforced my view that we need to have more of these kinds of sessions. Extremely useful, very productive, and it's only the beginning, I think, of not the end, of at least finding a hopeful reconciliation between faith and evolution, faith and science. And I think that that kind of reconciliation will have great consequences for the future, not only of the Islamic world, but I think the world in general. Thank you.
You ready? So, good evening. Hi, my name is Nasser Wadadi. I'm the Civil Rights Outreach Director at the American Islamic Congress. And I attended the event tonight as a private citizen, and I found it very interesting that we got a diversity of views. And I think that the questions from the audience actually addressed the almost tension in the title of the series, which is Science and Islam, which generally are thought of as mutually exclusive. And what we heard is the diversity of views through the panel that actually raised some pretty good points that actually I'd never thought about before. For instance, the notion of a difference between Christian and Islamic creationism, whereas Christian creationism rejects evolution wholesale. Islamic evolution or creationism seems to accommodate itself with evolution. But more importantly, I think that the real value of this panel was opening a platform and a safe space for the public, Muslims and non-Muslims, to come together and discuss these questions, because otherwise, if it wasn't for AIC, no one else is doing them. And I think that's the real value of it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Omar Sultan Haq. I'm an instructor and postdoctoral fellow at Harvard in the psychology department, and I study the psychology and philosophy of religion. I thought today's event went really well, and I especially appreciated the kind of contentious dialogue that was brought out. I thought it was really great because it allowed us to ask the question of what are the implications of a basic science on Islamic theology and philosophy. We have a lot of understanding and investment in applied sciences like engineering, computer science, but very rarely do we actually talk about what the implications are of our basic sciences. So I think this is a great opportunity to really think about the ways in which constructive dialogue can continue, and also to think about questions that have been wrestled with in other traditions that we have not yet had a chance to talk about.
So, should I start?
Yeah.
Okay. So, my name is Salman Hamid. I'm Director of the Center for Science in Muslim Societies at Hampshire College, and I'm Associate Professor of Integrated Science and Humanities. This has been a really rewarding experience because this touches a very important subject on Islam and evolution. And I think one of the missing voices from this discourse has been of academics and of biologists. And so I think American Islamic Congress and Project Nur, they've done a really fantastic job of at least providing a forum where we can have discussion on these issues that are important to a lot of people and lie at the intersection of science and religion. These are global debates, and this addresses a particular angle of how do Muslims and how does Islam negotiate its interactions with biological evolution.